if you look at reasons that people choose to be political, there are really 2 or 3 major variables that reappear all over the place. And I'm going to give 2 of the ones that are most important because they're really interesting. And since we're sort of talking about a little bit about a Buddhist orientation for some of this, in one of the variables, Buddha was a staunch Republican. And in another variable, he was a staunch Democrat. And these are the 2, so it gets pretty interesting. The 2 variables are, a lot of people still have a very hard time defining liberal and conservative, or the difference between Democrat and Republican. As far as I know, and I'm not saying this to brag, it's just we only sort of reconstructed this, and as far as I know, I introduced the first definition that's actually become widespread. Time magazine now uses it, and I did it in a book called Up from Eden. And the idea was, I was simply ask a person why human beings suffer and see what kind of answer they give. And you'll find they break down into 2 very general classes. So if you ask somebody in this culture, why is somebody poor? Ask a Republican, why is that person poor? The first things they'll tend to say is they don't work hard enough, they don't have a work ethic, they don't have family values, they're not responsible, they're on drugs, they're something. Ask a Democrat, and they'll say they were oppressed, we have an unjust society, they haven't been given an opportunity. In other words, the Republican or the conservative tends to situate the cause of human suffering in an interior. Something inside of you is causing your problems. Whereas the liberal tends to situate it on exterior social circumstances. Time magazine now calls these the interiorists and the exteriorists, which I thought was kind of interesting. And again, it's not a rigid one, but it's a fairly interesting way to get a sense about it. Now, there's another important one, several, but at least one other important one. Buddha was the ultimate, Gautama Buddha, was the ultimate Republican in this sense, because 100% of everything that happens to you is your karma. It's your doing. Even if somebody runs over you, that's your karma from a previous lifetime. Don't you blame anybody. It's your doing. Now, boy, is that alien to this culture. But it's one of the things that you don't...
Hence the personal injury suit.
Yeah. So, but that's an interesting one. Now, if you look at the quadrants, what it is that conservatives tend to put the cause for human sin or suffering on the interior. It's something that is going on inside of you. And liberals put the cause on the exterior. And therefore, that's where you'll see them wanting to tinker in order to make society better. Gun control, classic example. What do liberals want to do about gun control? Get rid of the guns. What do conservatives want to do? Raise kids that don't shoot other kids. And that's why they get infuriated at taking away guns, because they think liberals are just allowing anything to happen anyway. So they're encouraging people that are going to use guns. Now, I'm not choosing sides. I'm trying to, in this point, showing the partial truth in all of these. And that means partial untruth as well. We have to sort of deal with that. But so there's the one thing, is emphasis on the interior, emphasis on the exterior. There's one other one I'm going to pass over quickly because I want to get to the way in which Gautama Buddha was a Democrat. But the other of the 3 major variables you find in political theories, the other is which is more important, the rights of the individual or the rights of the collective? And just very simply, that's the upper quadrants and the lower quadrants. So without choosing sides, by using all 4 quadrants, we're at least acknowledging all of these variables that political theory is held to be important. And obviously, as an integral person, we're not going to choose just one and say the other doesn't count. That'll be sort of the first thing. Now there's a third component, and this is where Gautama Buddha was one of the first Democrats, and that is there's levels of development. And what happens here is that, particularly in this country, but you can see the similar thing around the world, it's just that they have different labels for the parties. Republicans classically are blue meme. So the staunch core of the Republican, and this is what drives most liberals crazy, is they're fundamentalists. They believe in the Bible as God's truth. They're ethnocentric. They believe homosexuality is a sin, and so on. And we know that it's a mythic membership, blue meme, conformist mode. Originally, the Western Enlightenment, where liberalism first came into existence, was the first orange, world-centric center of gravity in any large culture. And it said that all men and women are created equal. It's first said men because blue is very patriarchal, very ethnocentric, and very militaristic. It had to be at the time. 10,000 years ago, if you weren't blue, you were dead. Really, street gangs have to get together in order to survive. But orange was the first world-centric democratic organization. And that's what Gautama Buddha. Gautama Buddha was somebody who extended rights even to the untouchables. Actually, that caused more upset in India than his particular spiritual path, which wasn't all that different from Patanjali's 8 limbs. And so orange comes along, and it uses science to combat mythology, and it uses democracy to combat servitude, basically, slavery. And it uses representative government to counteract monarchy, basically. So if somebody's a Democrat, then usually they're going to be coming from orange or higher, but they're going to blame everything on the exterior. And if somebody's a Republican, they're coming from blue, and they're going to blame everything on the interior. When Bill Clinton, and I've told this before, I had about like a 1/1000% input into this decision because he was starting to read my books at the time, and he had read this whole series of footnotes where I was outlining an integral political theory that involved roughly just what we've been talking about, these different variables. So they were coming up with what they were calling the third way, or the vital center, and that was a way to integrate really interior and exterior. So Bill Clinton's Welfare Reform Act was called Opportunity and Responsibility. Opportunity means the exterior will provide the opportunity, but the interior has to be responsible. And he was violently attacked by both conservatives and liberals because he had actually hit on a third way. And that was fantastic. So whatever else you think of Bill, he knew forward real well. That was a move towards an integral. So watching Republican, now what they're doing, of course, let me mention one last thing because people have kind of noticed this. When the original liberals came into existence about 300 years ago, they were orange. And the aristocracy was blue, so slavery was allowed. 97% of all blue cultures have slavery, and they have some form of caste system. Thomas Jefferson was a blue thinker. Alexander Hamilton was orange. Jefferson was in favor of agrarian and slavery. He was a genius in many other ways, but he was a classic blue thinker trying to get up to orange in some ways. So, but the original Enlightenment tried to preach equality, fraternity, freedom, and so on. And it was to counterbalance the mythology and the dogma of the mythic membership, particularly of the church at that time. And Voltaire's battle cry was, remember the cruelties that the church has inflicted on people in the name of God. And so the first liberals were attempting to go from ethnocentric to world-centric. So it was no longer you had to believe in a particular God, no longer you had to be of a particular race. All men, and very soon all men and women, were created equal. And so that was a huge move from blue to orange. And then it was fairly clear then, the conservatives meant, no, we're holding on to what we have. And the liberals were often called progressives. No, we're evolving. We want to move forward. That's still a pretty good definition. But in the last 200 years, we moved a stage. And now you have two wings of both parties. And it's really funny because one of the wing overlaps. So Republicans, you have old-time blue Republicans. And you have orange Wall Street Republicans. And the blue Republicans scare the shit out of everybody, including the orange Republicans. But they're always trying to figure out how to pacify the base. And the base means those fundamentalist, blue, hardcore Republicans. And incidentally, if you look at a quadrant, blue almost always goes in the lower left, blue goes with agrarian in the lower right. All the farmers out in Kansas. Okay. So the progressive edge of the Republicans are orange, and they're Wall Street Republicans. And bizarrely, they're arguing the values of the Enlightenment. So they want individual rights, they want meritocracy, and that's a big difference between blue and orange. Blue is aristocracy. You inherit it. You're stuck with it. There is no vertical mobility at all. Orange deeply believes in meritocracy. If you can earn it, if you're smart enough, if you work, you can be president. That's absolutely unheard of in any blue culture anywhere in the world. You're born into royalty or fat chance. So you have the progressive orange Republicans now, are orange, and they're in bed with the old-time liberals that are still arguing the liberal values, but the edge of the Democratic Party now is green. And we know about that. It's the whole, sensitivity training and multiculturalism, and Saddam Hussein is misunderstood, and is, which I'm sure he is. So there's this whole interior conflict in the Liberal Party between its green, multicultural postmodernists versus the old-time modern liberal Democrats. And you find them hooking up, like I say, with progressive Republicans, a very kind of interesting friction sort of going on there. And then the last thing about it is that makes Democrats, there was that, Will Rogers' great old line was, I belong to no organized political party, I'm a Democrat. And the reason is that in addition to those two wings, both pre-conventional and post-conventional vote Democratic. Now, that's not everybody's allowed to be at whatever station they're at, but red votes with Democrat. It's not going to vote conformist. So the last thing I want to say about it is what we want to do with an integral approach to politics is try to cover all of those bases. Now, without saying one is right or one is wrong, the point is how can we balance them? There has to be a balance between individual and collective, between interior responsibility and exterior opportunity provided by a government that cares, as well as an insistence that we govern from the highest possible levels that we can, because that's the greatest amount of fairness for the greatest number of sentient beings. So how to balance that is what an integral politics wants to do. And we don't have the answers, but for the first time, we can frame those questions in a way that start to make sense. And you intuitively know that every one of those variables is important. You know every single one of those things is important. We can't do just one or just the other. So what's happening on the Republican convention this time is they're taking all of their nice orange Republicans and the ones that even have a little green. And so it looks like the bloody United Nations, from what I can tell. And their compassion on parade, But incidentally, compassionate conservatism was Karl Rove's attempt to get interior and exterior together. Because conservative is interior, compassionate is exterior. You can start to say, I can at least get a sense about what's happening if you have a little bit bigger map. So I watch this thing. What I mostly take away from this one is in today's world, the Western world had built a orange to green consensus that was world-centric. And even though I think it's extremely important, the one thing that we have to take from the conservatives that we don't have enough of is a little bit more responsibility for our own. And they're almost the only ones speaking for that. So that's part of the ingredients we really have to take into account. But when that world-centric consensus, when 9/11 happened, what often happens is, you regress a little, you move down. And we moved down from an orange to green to a blue to orange, ethnocentric, imperialistic kind of thing. And we started taking unilateral actions on the political world scene. Now, there are reasons for that, partial reasons, which is that blue understands red. And there were pockets of red out there that we just forgot about. And green not only has forgotten about red, it wants to, its new best friend. And so green is the last thing you want in charge of something like that. But green is the first thing you want in charge of the international communication network that had been built fragilely over several decades. So again, there are partial truths here. Blue is right to be worried witless about bands of red terrorists and what can happen. But the consensus has to be built at orange to green. And we pulled into a unilateral, imperialistic stance that does nobody any good. So that part bothers me. At least we are paying attention to red terrorists. We've got to do that. They were out there doing this. As soon as they dump plutonium into LA's drinking water, it's going to get ugly. So at least that was going on. But without putting it in a balanced context, we've had the United States drift down into an ethnocentric orientation. And for a superpower to do that with its allies, Europe is freaked out of its skull. And that, to me, is at least or more damaging than some of these other things. So it's a very, very difficult situation. And I watch both the Democrats and the Republicans, and my first response, I have two responses. It's almost sort of schizophrenic. One is you try to have a compassion for everything that's arising, and one is I'm so tired of first-tier warfare. They both think they've got the answer, and they don't. And you think, good heavens, with only 2% of the population that realizes that whatever these value structures are, a sane, enlightened society is going to have to find a way that people who stop at that station of life can stop at that station of life and find some way to express their values, but without imposing them on others.
Let me back up and give a couple reasons that integral politics is one of the most seriously difficult issues to consider. I mean, a truly integral politics. To begin with, if you're looking at it from the point of view of the voters, and if less than 10% of the voters are at integral stages, then a democracy guarantees no integral. Yikes. That's kind of a bad news item. So I'll come back to that issue, is in today's world of transparency, how do you actually get people with higher levels of consciousness? How do you get them into office when their only justification is, I'm better than y'all? It's a killer. It's a killer. I mean, why development, produces greater depth and less span? And now, of course, the pig and the python can change. I mean, the fact that development produces greater depth, less span, doesn't mean that this culture can't get a majority of its people into teal or turquoise as it continues to move forward. But it does mean that it takes a long time, and that it's not something that can readily be put into a political platform. It's just very, very difficult. If the founding framers of the Constitution in this country, what they actually were doing, looking back on it developmentally, was they were putting orange principles and laws into effect over amber, which is what they were trying to get away from. Getting away from ethnocentric, getting away from, they replaced mythic sources of knowledge with scientific sources of knowledge. They replaced ethnocentric with democracy and world-centric. They replaced slavery with freedom from that. And all of those are orange or social stage 5, social contract in Kohlberg's moral stages of development. If they had actually tried to justify that and say, okay, well, what we're doing, y'all, is we're creating a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that 10% of the people at orange is going to work a whole lot better if we have a constitution that's orange. And everybody else has to follow the orange constitution. You try pulling that today and see how far you get. You try coming along and saying turquoise is to today what orange was to 1776. And less than 10% of the population is turquoise. And our platform is, but they're smarter. Now, of course, they're not necessarily smarter. Just being at second tier means if you're stupid, you're colossally stupid. It means there are all sorts of ways you can screw things up. But the problem of integral politics, part of it is just that, is how do you actually get a political party into power that is based on anything like this? And so part of what we're looking at is basically enlightened leadership. I mean, leadership that has an understanding that the whole point about somebody being at a, quote, higher stage is not that they're at a higher stage. It's that so you can adjust the way you communicate with people at every stage. It's to be more effective with the entire spectrum of individuals at different levels of resonance, at different levels of unfolding, at different levels of development. And these different levels also are going to be not only stages of development, but stations in life. Because people have a right to stop at whatever level of development they want to, number one. And number two, even if they didn't, we don't know how to transform people very well anyway. It is a mystery how and why and exactly people transform. And it doesn't do to say the way most of the integral governance projects that I've seen, some of which are wonderful on side issues, miss this central issue. What they have is maybe they have 3 houses and then 3 houses within those. And then one of the houses is like a house of wisdom, and people in that are at integral stages and are there to oversee the other stuff that's being done. That's the easy part, claiming that. How do you get them elected into the so-called House of Wisdom? And how do you define what the House of Wisdom is? Right, it's that place where all the smarter people go. 0 chance of getting that put into place non-coercively. So simply going in and saying, well, what we have to have is a House of Wisdom, well, that is nothing. That contributes nothing to the issue. The issue is, how do you justify the House of Wisdom that is developmentally higher than 90% of the rest of the population? How do you dare justify that in today's world? Getting an actual politics in place that's integrally informed is an extraordinarily difficult issue. And it's the one that just really catches me up. I do think, just to repeat briefly the one part, that the next decade or so, what we're going to see is a continued discussion by actual leaders of just this issue. Because even Green is starting to realize, in all their books, Green, and in the wake of, is, what do we do about Kansas? They write books like that, all those square states, those agrarian states that have mythic membership, traditional values. What do we do about traditional values? They're starting slowly to realize it's a developmental issue. And by shooting all developmental growth holarchies in the foot, you just shot yourself in the head. And they're slowly starting to get to that position. But that's where the discussion's going to be occurring. And I just get frozen up at almost those issues on the way to thinking about some of the things that you brought up. I think before we can actually have a discussion about integral politics, that some fairly big changes need to be made in American politics, changes that are that they're big enough to scare people. They scare me. And it's in a sense going into parliamentary types of systems as opposed to this big two-party system. Because what happened with the two-party system, it came into being when left and right first came into being. And then that was fine. Because there were only basically two parties. There was the left and there was the right. And the left were those who sat on the left side of the aisle at the French Assembly and were basically revolutionary and essentially orange. And those on the right were traditionalists, aristocratic, militaristic, patriarchal, so on, and essentially amber, mythic membership, blue V meme, that essential structure. And having two parties go at it for a couple hundred years, in a sense, was fine when most people of sort of intelligent voting age were either amber or orange, were either traditional or modern. But a sneaky little thing happened over the last 50 years, and that's that the leading edge split from orange into orange and green. And that left the Republicans with an inner split as well, which is they were no longer just pure amber or pure traditionalists. They were now orange and amber. So the Republicans had their progressive wing, the Wall Street Republicans, and the Wall Street Republicans were essentially orange in many, many ways. And they agreed with most of the enlightenment, liberal values, which is why we get the neocons that are liberals in an old-fashioned sense, which is really kind of funny. And then they're really sort of the gut central core of the Republican Party remains the traditionalists at amber, and they're fundamentalists and anti-abortion and in favor of not only prayer in school, but prayer in every one of y'all's houses. Y'all have to become believers as well. And so that, all of a sudden now we've really got 4 major parties instead of 2. And then that's not counting red, which usually goes with Democrat, because there's pre-conventional and post-conventional, and red as pre-conventional, it always goes with post-conventional. So those that are red go with Democrats, because where else are you going to get a chance to have people say it's okay for presidents of the United States to get blowjobs? So red's all in favor of that. So red's in favor of that, any of that. So red, but leaving that out, we have 4 major parties now. This is where it's getting sticky. And one of the major problems in terms of somebody who's generally liberal is that what's happened is it's very hard to get orange and green together. And now those are the 2 major wings of the Democratic Party. And the old Democrats are enlightenment value Democrats. They believe in individual rights, versus green, which believes in group rights. And green believes that the right not to have your feelings hurt trumps free speech. It's very hard to get green and orange together. And of course, green hates orange. Because orange is capitalist this and capitalist that, and green is anti-capitalist everything. And so what you have in the Democratic Party is you have these two wings that loathe each other. And the leading edge of those two is green. And green actually has their presidential candidates get up and say in a veiled manner, I hate Western civilization, I hate this country, I hate the Enlightenment, I hate what's going on anywhere around here, but elect me your president. Who wants to elect this guy president who hates the whole civilization? So it's been easier for Karl Rove to unite amber and orange Republicans than it has been for anybody to unite orange and green Democrats. Now what that means is that the essentially and those two blocks are about 50-50. It used to be Democrats could count on getting out the vote because it was just a labor vote. It was essentially their core old-time labor. And so they could get out the vote in Chicago and get out the mass labor vote wherever they needed to. Now, I'm essentially, and sort of as a brand name, neither merely Democrat nor Republican. As you all know anything sort of about integral political theory, the left and the right are defined as interiorists and exteriorists. There's been an intense attempt ever since the beginning of left and right to come up with a definition of them that works. And nobody's really succeeded. Even so recently, we've had Boblio, an Italian political theorist, come out with a book called Left and Right, A Useful Political Distinction. In other words, still keeping the distinction around. And he defines it as right believes in differences and left believes in no differences between people. Now, you can see where he got that. The right believes in old-fashioned caste systems and aristocracies and so on. They do believe in differences between humans. And the left doesn't. The left believes in everybody's equal. But that doesn't really hold up for various reasons. And so I've come up with a definition that actually does seem to hold up. And that is, this is for describing just left and right now, not Democrat and Republican, because Democrat and Republican have a lot of other things going on in them. But ask somebody where they think human suffering comes from. What's the main cause of human suffering? If you go to, why is somebody poor? You go to a Republican, they'll say, you don't have a work ethic, you don't have family values, you're not working hard enough, you aren't applying yourself hard enough. The problem's with you. Go to a Democrat, go to a leftist, and they'll say, society has not given you the opportunity, society has not given you an education, society has held you down, society is oppressing you. And the real difference between left and right is where they see the cause of human suffering. It doesn't lie interiorly or it doesn't lie exteriorly. And so I basically believe, of course, that you have to balance both. It's the same when Bill Clinton came out with his welfare bill called Responsibility and Opportunity. The responsibility part is your interior part. And that was to make the Republicans happy. And the responsibility of the opportunity part was the government gives you a helping hand. And that's the liberal part. And it was his attempt during the period where around the world what was called a third way politics was being put together. And I had a very small part to do with the theory of it in this country. Anthony Giddens was working with Tony Blair in Britain. There were 14 other major world political leaders that were working on a third way or in third wave politics, which was to blend the left and the right. And all of that fell apart with a cigar, I guess. And it's never quite been put back together again. But I think that because we have these four parties, the two-party system doesn't work very well anymore. And one of the transition things that might have to happen is that we come up with a parliamentary form of government that allows orange and green and amber their own parties. And once that happens, I think there are certain ways, which I won't get into, but there are certain ways within the Senate and the House where you could have this essential problem of the House of Wisdom. There is at least a way to try coming up with that. But it's only going to happen if we change essentially from the two-party system. The two-party system is going to force all of the first-tier parties to split into just two and then just pick one. And I don't think that serves us well. And it forces people with green values to get stuck with orange policies, orange to get stuck with amber, amber to get stuck with red, and so on. So I think we really are going to have to think through that part of it. And that part is scary because it's a big change. And the United States is many things around the world, and it's a joke in Europe, of course, because, as I put it, we have no culture. And that's true. We're a young country. And we don't have these 1,000-year-old cultures that every other part of the world has. But we have one thing. We are the oldest democracy on the planet. And that is not something you want to tamper with lightly. So, and yet if we don't, I think we're going to continue to get stuck with some of these real problems about the transparency of justifying integral in a world that claims to be egalitarian. That's something to think about, I guess.
I'm just going to talk a little bit about integral politics. And this is true for any number of theories, but given that individuals have access to these 5 fundamental elements, quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types, these are impacting them constantly. And so when they are asked to form an opinion or actually have to sit down and think through a theory or work some problem out or whatnot, these different dimensions impact them. and will, depending on what their aqual constellation is, will determine which of these elements have an impact, and the nature of the impact, and what variety it is, what color it is, what flavor it is, and so on. And it's particularly interesting if you look at politics, because there are a certain number of political theories that have been advanced from the sort of beginning of human history per se. And these, of course, correlate very well with the elements of aqua. So if we start with quadrants and we look at the individual quadrants, the upper quadrants, and then we look at the lower quadrants, the collective quadrants, there are theories that emphasize the centrality of the individual, and there are political theories that emphasize the centrality of the system or the totalitarian regime. Laurie Chickering and Drexel Sprecher came up with a typology that's been widely used in terms of classifying political theories. And it's a 4-quadrant affair, and its upper quadrants are free, known as free, F-R-E-E, and its lower quadrants are essentially order. So they're known as free and order, and then the left and right quadrants are known as left and right. Now, they don't give a good definition of left and right. The only good definition of left and right is the one that I gave as early back as Up from Eden. But if you emphasize the significance of individual freedom, then you're emphasizing the upper quadrants. And if you emphasize contrarily, the importance of the overall system, and you give the rights of the system preeminence over rights of the individual, then you have various forms of totalitarianism. And so that for them would be order. If we look at the left-hand quadrants and the right-hand quadrants, then we get into definitions of left and right. And the definitions themselves first came into widespread use in the French Assembly, where it was just literally that individuals that had leftist theories, which of course were just rising at that time, the time of the Enlightenment, then the individuals that sat on the left side of the Parliament were called the left, and those sitting on the right-hand side were called the right. And that's literally where it got started. It's been a distinction that's stuck around ever since then. And one of the main reasons is, if you look at how to define it, and there's really been, in my opinion, only one definition that really covers all the bases and has held up. First of all, progressive and conservative won't do it, because you can have progressive Democrats and conservative Democrats, and you can have progressive Republicans and conservative Republicans. So although those are often used synonymously, they're not really good definitions. But if you ask a person, why do human beings suffer, then somebody from the right, Republican, will tell you that they suffer because they don't have the right values, they don't have family values, they don't have a work ethic, they're not working hard enough. It's essentially their fault. And if you ask somebody from the left, why do people suffer, they'll say, well, it's because they're marginalized, they're oppressed, they are not given all the opportunities in life that they should be given. In other words, it's society's fault versus being the individual's fault. And that's a distinction that is held up. And I was interested to note that in Time magazine, in one of their main editorials, they started using those definitions. They said if what we can call interiorists, namely those who believe that the cause of suffering comes from the interior, and exteriorists, those who believe the cause of suffering comes from the exterior. The reason that exterior started to become popular at the time of the Enlightenment is that this was the first time that we started to get the notion that you can engineer society, that you can actually create a society that is progressive and liberal and will make things better for people. And of course, the Marxist notion was the ultimate notion of that. Marx was also one of the first to use the theme, or the notion, the idea of revolution. Revolution was just really unheard of prior to Marx's period. So in the Chickering Drexel-Sprecher typology, you have free and order, left and right. And so this is exactly playing off the quadrants. Which ones, when you actually introspect and start to feel what one is the most important, what one has the largest role to play in culture, in politics, and so on, are you going to emphasize the upper quadrants and you want individuals to have emphasis? Then those are going to tend towards more likely forms of democracy. If you emphasize the lower quadrants, then you're going to feel that totalitarian regimes are the better form of governance. And in some cases, these totalitarian regimes are preludes to the real form of government that's on its way. And so we find this in certain forms of Marxism, for example. But the idea is, as you're kind of introspecting and feeling which one's important, if you think individual freedom is more important than states' rights or totalitarian regimes, then you're emphasizing the upper quadrants and de-emphasizing the lower quadrants. If, on the other hand, you think that group rights and governmental sovereignty are more important than an individual right, then you're emphasizing the lower quadrants. If you think that, if you're basically a leftist thinker, then you're going to be emphasizing the exterior quadrants. And you're very likely going to have certain programs, certain ideas about how to improve society in a way that is going to make it better and better and better, make human suffering less and less and less. Whereas if you are a member of the right, you're going to think that an individual is suffering essentially because it's their own fault. They don't have the right values, they don't have the right work ethic, they're not putting enough effort into getting a job and working and getting a salary and so on. Sometimes I like to point out that given those definitions, Gautama Buddha was an ultimate Republican, which freaks everybody out. But according to Buddha, what happens to you is your fault. 100% your fault. Karma, baby. And so it's that lands Gautama Buddha in the primordial, far right camp. Now, the thing that makes him a little bit more interesting than just being a Republican is that he was also one of the first that had a clear world-centric view of morality. So he included, for example, the untouchables in his system of yoga. So much for one of the first Republican spiritual leaders. There are other factors, of course, in the alchemical framework, and one has to do with whether emphasis is put on translation or whether it's put on transformation. And if it's put on transformation, then it's progressive. It's looking to fundamentally change the nature of culture and society in a progressive fashion. So it wants to transform the culture into higher, deeper, wider forms of activity. And so progressive becomes one of the possible ways to define the political theory that you happen to believe in. On the other hand, if you emphasize just translation and without any progressive change, then you are emphasizing just staying where you are and just continuing to translate reality the way that you are. And that, again, is one of the commonly confused definitions with left and right, is that left is progressive and right is conservative. But that's not technically a good definition, and you can have cross versions of that. There are progressive and conservative members of the left and of the right. Again, the only definition really holding up of left and right is where do you locate the source of human suffering. Prior to the Enlightenment and the emergence of the left, first of all, we see the left emerge in the Enlightenment, really for the first time, because the Enlightenment is the first time that you have a fairly widespread world-centric morality. And so there's a definite feeling that culture is unfair and it needs to be actively engineered and changed for more and more better forms. And this is one of the sort of definitions of the Enlightenment is the belief in progress, the belief in betterment, and that hinged on a notion of there being a way that you can actually improve human suffering and that you can engineer society in a way that is going to make things better. And so that's why for the first time we start to see political theories of the left, and some of the first being liberal, actually theories known as liberal, come to the forefront. And as such, it was often originally identified with orange altitude. Now, that, again, that's not a good definition of left, because there's also green versions of left. But the first version, when you start to see the shift in the center of values and cultural values, up until the Enlightenment, there was essentially two fundamental And with the emergence of the Enlightenment, there was essentially two fundamental parties. One, there was the traditionalists, which were mythic membership, monarchical, aristocratic, and had typically been the form of governance for the previous 1,000 years. And then with the emergence of the Enlightenment, there is the first emergence of liberal political theory and theory that is looking to make things better by social engineering and by fundamentally changing the structure of society. And so at that time, there would be, as we would say in the States, there would be sort of just two major parties. There'd be Republican, which is traditional, aristocratic, militaristic, patriarchal, fundamentalistic, and so on, and Democratic. And this would be liberal and progressive and exteriorist and so on. And that's about the way it was for some close to 300 years. And then what started to happen is, as evolution continued to move forward, then the leading edge tended to move forward. And we started to get a shift within parties along the lines of those aspects of parties that were identified with altitude. So, in other words, Democrats, which originally were technically defined as exteriorists, but they also just happened to show up and be identified with orange, with world-centric. That wasn't their technical definition, but that was where they tended to show up first. As evolution continued and we see altitude shift up, then Democrats split into two wings and Republicans split into two wings. The two wings of the Democrats were orange and green. So there was an old-time Democratic left theory, and it was identified with orange values, individual rights, meritocracy, achievement, etc. And then there was a new version of the left, and that was essentially green. And that was diametrically opposed to orange and the orange left, the old left. The new left despised everything about Western culture and despised everything about the values of the old Enlightenment, and in particular despised reason and anything that had to do with reason or rationality. And so there were these two sort of sub-branches of the left, of the Democratic Party. And while that was going on, then the right was also shifting up. And roughly speaking, half of the right moved from amber, which is where it started, into orange and became so-called Wall Street Republicans or Ayn Rand Republicans and so on. And these were Republicans that sort of ironically identified with the old Democrats, with the old left. And then there was left in amber the old right. And the old right remained fundamentalist and patriarchal and sexist, and the Bible is a strict word of Jesus and is literally true, and so on. And generally speaking, it's easier to get orange and amber together than it is to get orange and green together. Orange and green just don't get along well at all. And so what we've seen in the last few presidential parties is this sort of insane wobbling in terms of how the Democratic president presents himself and the values that he supports. It was most sort of piteously ridiculed in Al Gore, who was accused of having a different public persona every time he stepped on stage. And that's going back and forth between orange and green, orange and green, orange and green. And it's fundamentally problematic when you are trying to run a political party in the West that has a strong green component. Because what green actually says is, I hate everything about your culture, I hate everything about your country, I hate everything about your political values, but oh, by the way, vote for me. Not a lot of impetus to do that when that's your real attitude to the country that you want to represent, the country you want to lead. And yet that's what we're seeing happening with the left and with the Democratic Party. And it's going to continue to be a problem until we actually move in to second tier. And until that time, Democrats are going to have just a horrid time trying to decide what their actual value structures are. Are they going to be orange or are they going to be green? Meanwhile, the Republicans, the right, are going to have problems, but they're not nearly as difficult problems as the left is having, as the Democrats are having. So they just give kind of a nod to the fundamentalists, and if they do have a problem, it is the fundamentalists, because they sort of drive everybody crazy. They even drive most Republicans crazy, and they're just kind of stuck in figuring out what to do with the old-time religion and the Republican far right. It's one of the reasons that they've been able to do really relatively rare in presidential elections, considering that they have fewer numbers than Democrats. And the reason is just that it's easier to get amber and orange together than it is to get orange and green together. So that's an issue that's going to continue to plague the parties as we go forward. It's particularly going to plague the left. And the left has the green version of left has no qualms whatsoever about stating just how much they loathe the West. And the Enlightenment is particularly a problem and is viewed as the source of all marginalization and oppression and just bad news in general. And of course, that's historically pretty much the opposite of the way it was. The orange structure was the first structure in history that actually outlawed slavery, that started the feminist movement, and that really is associated with an enormous number of emancipatory movements. Problem with modern orange is that after differentiating the value spheres of the good, the true, and the beautiful, it dissociated them. And so that led to scientific materialism and a general slide into reductionism as part of the sort of official philosophy of the West. So what we continue to see in terms of the way that the political parties are created and established is a continuing fragmentation and really brokenness, partialness in terms of worldviews. And it's really pretty catastrophic when you have political theories which are supposed to be in one way or another. Political theories are the way that you bring people together in the governance system. And to have political theories that are that fragmented and that fractured and that broken is really disastrous. And I don't see any real cure for that until we start to get a substantial number of people into second tier. That's the only time when perhaps we're going to see a tipping point. It's the only time where we're going to see values that are genuinely inclusive start to seep down through the culture at large and start to redress this fractured view of politics that we have now. And until then, it's a disaster. And it's a disaster because political theories keep fracturing themselves into interiorist versus exteriorist, individualist versus collectivist, progressive versus translative, and then at different altitudes. And so this is no way to get any sort of union or any sort of coming together of a political culture at all. It's a way to continue to have it fragmented and separated and partial and broken, and no single political will that can be generated in order to face some of the really, really difficult problems that the world is facing right now, whether it's financial crises or global climate problems, world population, terrorism. All of those demand a political will that is to some degree united, that's to some degree pulled together, and that can respond to these problems with a single voice and in a way that has a powerful response to the problems that we're facing. Otherwise, it's just the same old, and we continue to get nothing but fractured and partial political approaches to the world's problems. And that is really in itself catastrophic, because it doesn't let us formulate anything resembling solutions to these problems, and doesn't allow us to formulate a way to move forward and actually get something done in the face of the world's really wicked problems right now.